I used to work at this mid-sized accounting firm downtown. Nothing fancy, just your typical corporate environment with beige cubicles and that awful fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like they're dying. The company was called Henderson and Associates, and let me tell you, the associates part was doing a lot of heavy lifting because old man Henderson had been dead for like 15 years. My boss was this guy named Brad Mitchell. Yeah, I know what you're thinking, of course his name was Brad. He was everything you'd expect from a middle manager named Brad: polo shirts, khakis, that weird aggressive handshake thing, and a voice that could make reading the phone book sound condescending. Brad had been with the company for about 8 years and had that special kind of confidence that only comes from failing upward through corporate America. I'd been working there for 3 years as a senior accountant, and honestly, I was pretty good at my job. I had great relationships with clients, never missed deadlines, and actually enjoyed the work most days. The pay was decent, the benefits weren't terrible, and my coworkers were mostly cool people just trying to get through their days like everyone else. But Brad had it out for me from day one. I never really understood why. Maybe it was because I'd gone to a better college than him, or maybe because some of the clients specifically asked for me instead of him. Could have been that I drove a nicer car than his beat-up Honda Civic. Who knows? The point is, this guy made my life miserable for no good reason. He'd micromanage everything I did, question my methods even when they got results, and had this annoying habit of taking credit for my work in meetings. You know the type, the kind of boss who says, "we," when things go well and "you," when they don't. The final straw came during our annual client review season. This is always the most stressful time of year because everyone's scrambling to make sure their numbers are perfect before the big presentation to the board. I'd been working on this massive account for months, a local restaurant chain called Tony's Pizza Palace. They had about 15 locations and their books were, well, let's just say they needed a lot of help. I'd spent countless hours reorganizing their entire financial system, found thousands of dollars in tax deductions they'd been missing, and basically saved them from a potential audit nightmare. The owner, this really nice guy named Anthony Rossi, was thrilled with my work. He even sent a letter to our office praising my attention to detail and professionalism. So naturally, Brad decides to schedule a meeting with Anthony without telling me. Shows up at Tony's main location wearing his important business meeting tie, you know the one, probably bought it at Men's Warehouse during a buy-one-get-one sale. He proceeds to present all of my work as his own, takes full credit for the tax savings, and even has the audacity to suggest that I was just following his brilliant strategy the whole time. Anthony calls me later that day, confused as heck. "Hey Mike," he says, "I just met with your boss Brad, and he's claiming he did all the work on my account. That's not true, is it? Because I specifically remember working with you on everything." I had to do this awkward dance where I couldn't throw my boss under the bus but also couldn't lie to a client I'd built a great relationship with. Well, Anthony, Brad is my supervisor, so technically all my work goes through him. You know how it is, you've got to play the corporate game even when it makes you want to scream. But inside, I was furious. This wasn't just about taking credit, this was about my professional reputation. Anthony trusted me, and now Brad was making it look like I was some junior employee who just does what he's told. That night, I went home to my tiny apartment, microwaved some leftover Chinese food, and stared at the ceiling for about 2 hours thinking about what to do. I could file a complaint with HR, but Brad was buddies with the HR director. I could talk to the partners, but they barely knew who I was. I could quit, but I needed the job and honestly, I liked the work itself. That's when it hit me. I wasn't going to get revenge, that's too dramatic and potentially career-destroying. But I could definitely teach Brad a lesson about taking credit where credit isn't due. The key was to be smart about it and make sure everything I did was completely above board and professional. See, Brad had one major weakness: he was lazy. Not just regular workplace lazy, but impressively, almost artistically lazy. He'd built his entire management style around delegating everything to other people and then swooping in at the last minute to take credit. The problem was, he never actually understood the work well enough to explain it properly. I started keeping detailed records of everything, every email, every phone call, every meeting. I documented my processes, saved my drafts, and made sure I had a paper trail for every decision I made. Brad never noticed because, well, he never paid attention to the actual work anyway. The opportunity came about 2 months later. Our biggest client, a manufacturing company called Steelwood Industries, was having some serious financial issues. Their CFO had been embezzling money for years, and they needed someone to come in and completely rebuild their accounting systems from the ground up. This was exactly the kind of high-profile, complex project that could make or break careers. Naturally, Brad immediately volunteered our team for the job. Not because he wanted to do the work, mind you, but because he knew it would look great on his performance review if we pulled it off. The partners were impressed with his initiative and put him in charge of the entire project. Here's where it gets interesting. Brad assumed this would be like every other project. He'd dump all the actual work on me and the other accountants, then show up for the final presentation to take credit. But Steelwood was different. Their new CFO, a sharp woman named Patricia Williams, had been brought in specifically to clean house and prevent future fraud. She didn't trust anyone and wanted to be involved in every step of the process. Patricia insisted on weekly progress meetings where she'd ask detailed questions about methodology, risk assessment, and implementation timelines. She wanted to understand not just what we were doing, but why we were doing it and how it would prevent future problems. Brad panicked. He'd committed us to this massive project without understanding the scope, promised unrealistic timelines, and now had to face weekly interrogations from someone who actually knew accounting. His usual strategy of showing up with a PowerPoint full of buzzwords wasn't going to work. So he did what he always did, dumped everything on me. "Mike," he said, cornering me by the coffee machine one Monday morning, "I need you to handle the Steelwood meetings for the next few weeks. I've got some other high-priority projects that need my attention." I knew this was my chance. "Sure, Brad, no problem. But Patricia is pretty detail-oriented. She's going to want to know about every aspect of our approach. Should I just tell her that I'm implementing your strategy, or do you want to brief me on your specific vision for the project?" You could see the wheels turning in his head. He had no strategy, no vision, no clue what he'd gotten us into. "Just, handle it, Mike. You know how I like to work. Use your judgment." Perfect. He'd just given me carte blanche to run the project however I wanted, while still expecting to take credit for the results. This was going to be easier than I thought. I threw myself into the Steelwood project like my career depended on it, which, in a way, it did. I spent hours studying their old systems, identifying vulnerabilities, and designing new processes that would be both efficient and secure. I researched industry best practices, consulted with forensic accounting specialists, and even took an online course in fraud detection just to make sure I was covering all the bases. Patricia was impressed. Really impressed. She started asking specifically for me in meetings, praising my thoroughness, and even mentioned to Brad how lucky he was to have such a dedicated team member. Brad would just smile and nod, taking credit without having any idea what we were actually discussing. The project was going amazingly well. We were ahead of schedule, under budget, and Patricia was talking about potentially expanding our contract to cover some of their subsidiary companies. This was turning into the kind of success story that gets written up in industry magazines. About 6 weeks into the project, Patricia dropped a bombshell. Steelwood's board of directors wanted a comprehensive presentation on our methodology and findings. Not just a summary, they wanted a deep dive into every aspect of what we discovered and how we'd rebuilt their systems. And they wanted it from the project lead personally. Brad was thrilled. This was exactly the kind of high-visibility opportunity he'd been waiting for. A chance to present to a board of directors, showcase his leadership, and probably get some great LinkedIn content out of it. He immediately started planning his presentation, asking me to put together some slides he could use. Here's where my plan really kicked into gear. I'd been documenting everything for months, remember? Every decision, every methodology, every late-night discovery that led to a breakthrough. I had folders full of evidence showing exactly who had done what work. I helped Brad prepare his presentation, but I was very careful about what information I gave him. I provided high-level summaries and general talking points, but I didn't give him the deep technical details that Patricia and the board would undoubtedly ask about. When he asked for specifics, I'd say things like, "Oh, you probably don't need to get into the weeds on that part. I'm sure they'll be more interested in the big picture." The night before the presentation, Brad was nervous. Really nervous. He kept asking me questions about implementation details and risk matrices and compliance protocols. I could see him starting to realize that he was in over his head, but it was too late to back out now. "Mike," he said, pulling me aside as we were packing up to leave, "maybe you should come to the presentation tomorrow. You know, for technical support." This was it. The moment I'd been waiting for. "Gosh, Brad, I'd love to help, but didn't you say this was a leadership opportunity? Something about showing the board your executive presence? I wouldn't want to step on your toes." He looked genuinely panicked for a second, then forced a smile. "Right, yeah, of course. I've got this. It's my project, after all." "Absolutely," I agreed. "Your project, your presentation, your moment to shine." The next morning, I got to the office early and did something I'd never done before. I called in sick. Well, not exactly sick. I told our receptionist that I had a family emergency and might not be reachable for most of the day. Then I drove to a coffee shop about 2 miles away and waited. Patricia called me around 10:30 a.m. "Mike? I'm sorry to bother you, but we're having some issues with the presentation. Brad is here, but he seems to be having trouble answering some of our technical questions. Is there any chance you could join us remotely or come in?" "Oh no," I said, doing my best to sound concerned. "I'm actually dealing with a family situation right now." "What kind of questions are they asking?" "Maybe I can help over the phone." "Well, they want to understand the specific methodology you use to identify the control weaknesses, and Brad keeps referring to industry best practices without being able to explain what that means in our context." I could hear Brad's voice in the background, and he did not sound happy. "You know what, Patricia, let me see if I can get away for a few minutes. This presentation is really important." 20 minutes later, I walked into Steelwood's conference room to find Brad looking like he'd been through a blender. His shirt was wrinkled, his face was red, and he had that deer-in-headlights expression that comes from being completely out of your depth in front of important people. The board members looked relieved to see me. Patricia introduced me as the technical lead who did most of the detailed analysis, and I could see Brad's jaw tighten. This wasn't going according to his plan at all. For the next hour, I fielded every question they threw at me. I explained our methodology, walked them through our findings, and detailed our implementation strategy. I had answers for everything because I'd actually done the work. Brad just sat there, occasionally nodding or saying, "Exactly," when I made a particularly good point. The board was blown away. They asked thoughtful questions, complimented our thoroughness, and even asked if I'd be available to present our case study at an industry conference they were sponsoring. It was honestly one of the best professional moments of my career. After the presentation, Patricia walked us out to our car. "Mike," she said, "I have to ask, who actually led this project? Because based on what I just saw in there, it seems like you did most of the heavy lifting." Before I could answer, Brad jumped in. "Well, you know, Mike is a great team member. Really follows direction well. But this was my project from the beginning. I just believe in empowering my people to present their own work." Patricia looked at him for a long moment, then turned to me. "Mike, I'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting with you next week to discuss expanding our engagement. Can you handle that, or do you need to check with your supervisor first?" "I'll handle it," I said. "I'll send you my direct contact information." The drive back to the office was awkward. Brad was clearly furious but trying to play it cool. Finally, he couldn't help himself. "You know, Mike, I'm not sure it was appropriate for you to take center stage like that. This was supposed to be my presentation." "Brad," I said calmly, "they asked technical questions that I had the answers to. Would you have preferred that I let you struggle through topics you weren't prepared for?" He was quiet for the rest of the drive. The next week, Patricia called me directly to discuss the expanded engagement. She also mentioned that she'd been so impressed with our work that she'd recommended us to 2 other companies in their network. But here's the kicker, she specifically requested that I be the lead on all future projects. When Brad found out, he was livid. He tried to spin it as his strategy all along, claiming he'd developed my skills and positioned me for success. But word had gotten around the office about what happened at the presentation, and people weren't buying it. 3 months later, Brad was quietly transferred to a different division where he couldn't do as much damage. I got promoted to senior project manager with a nice raise and my own office. I never got revenge on Brad, I didn't need to. I just made sure that when the moment came, the person who did the work got the credit for it. Sometimes the best way to teach someone a lesson isn't through some elaborate scheme or public humiliation. Sometimes it's just letting them face the natural consequences of their actions. Brad learned that you can't build a career on other people's work forever. Eventually, someone's going to ask you to explain what you actually did, and you better have a good answer ready. As for me, I learned that documentation is everything, that good work speaks for itself, and that sometimes the best way to handle a difficult boss is to give them exactly what they ask for, the chance to take all the credit, and all the responsibility that comes with it. The Steelwood project became a huge success story for our firm. We ended up working with them for 2 more years, and the case study Patricia mentioned did get presented at that industry conference. I was the one who presented it, of course. Brad was probably at home that day, figuring out how to explain to his new boss why his previous team had been so successful without him. I still work at Henderson and Associates, by the way. Different boss now, a woman named Jennifer who actually understands the work and gives credit where it's due. Funny how much more enjoyable your job becomes when you're working with adults instead of overgrown children. And sometimes, when I'm having a tough day, I remember that moment in the Steelwood conference room when Brad realized he was completely out of his depth, and I smile a little. Not because I enjoyed watching him struggle, but because justice has a way of working itself out if you're patient enough to let it happen.